Well, it's a great honour to join you here tonight, and I express my support for your initiative to build equality across the UK. As you know, 2017 is the 50th anniversary of the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in England and Wales. And I emphasise partial, because in fact, the criminalisation of homosexuality in the UK did not end until 2013. So don't be fooled by the celebrations this July to mark the 50th anniversary of the Sexual Offences Act 1967. That legislation was just a start. It was the first gay law reform since anal sex was made a crime in 1533 during the reign of King Henry VIII, and since all other sexual acts between men were outlawed in the Victorian era in 1885. My new research reveals that the liberalisation in 1967 was not nearly as liberal as many people believe. Certainly it was progress, but an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 men were convicted in the decades after 1967. So homosexuality was certainly only very partly decriminalised. Indeed, all the pre-existing anti-gay laws were retained on the statute book, and they were actually policed more aggressively than before by a British state that still opposed gay acceptance and equality. In total, from 1885 to 2013, I calculate that around 100,000 men were arrested for same-sex acts during that 128 years. So, as I said, the 1967 legislation was progress. It was an advance. It was a gain for our community. It did repeal the maximum penalty of life imprisonment for anal sex, and it did end the blanket outlawing of all homosexual acts. But when you think about it, the fact that anal sex remained on the statute books with a maximum penalty of life imprisonment until 1967 is truly, truly shocking. So it was a limited reform, and it still discriminated. For example, pandering to the homophobic notion that young men are seduced and corrupted by older men, in 1967, the age of consent was set at 21 for sex between men, compared to 16 for sex between men and women. Indeed, the punishment for a man aged 21 or over having non-anal sex with a man aged 16 to 21 was actually increased from 2 to 5 years. In other words, gay sex remained prosecutable unless it took place in strict privacy, which in legal terms meant in a person's own home, behind locked doors and windows, with the curtains drawn, and with no other person present in any part of the house. So if you were a student and lived in a house of multiple occupation, sharing a house with other students, and if you were gay and you brought your boyfriend home and you had sex while your flatmates were in their bedroom or the living room, both you and they were committing an offence. You were having sex in a non-private place, and they were aiding and abetting an unlawful homosexual act. It continued to be a crime if more than 2 men had sex together. There's never been a law against group heterosexual sex, but there was if more than 2 men had sex together. or if men were filmed or photographed having sex by a third person. Now, lest you think this is ancient history, 7 men in Bolton, in the Northwest, were convicted of these offences, and 2 were given suspended jail terms and put on the sex offenders register in 1998, over 30 years after 1967. Now, all these men were partners or former partners. They were all friends who knew each other, and they had consensual sex in the privacy of their own home. But more than 2 people were present, and in some cases, the sexual acts were filmed or photographed by a third person. The court deemed in 1998 that that was a serious criminal offence. The younger men got off relatively lightly, but the 2 older men, or slightly older men, they got the suspended jail terms and substantial fines, on the judge's presumption that they had corrupted the younger men. So the ideas of corruption and seduction, which had motivated an unequal age of consent way back in the Wolfenden Report in 1957 and the Sexual Offences Act in 1967, that remained a judicial ethos even in the late 1990s. You know, at the end of the day, those men's lives were ruined. And Terry Connell, one of the key defendants, died very soon afterwards, in no doubt partly due to the stress and strain of the prosecution and the shame that was put upon him by the courts. The other thing about the 1967 Sexual Offences Act was that it only applied to England and Wales, not being extended to Scotland until 1980, and not to Northern Ireland until 1982. The legislation also did not include the armed forces or the merchant navy, where sex between men remained a serious criminal offence. Indeed, gay military personnel and merchant seamen could still be jailed until 1994 for behaviour that was no longer a crime between civilians in private. And some of those men suffered terrible, terrible abuse in military prisons. I not long ago interviewed a man from Manchester, Stephen Close, who was arrested, taken to court-martial, and was sentenced to a jail term. And he was abused both while awaiting military trial and subsequently. He found it impossible to get a job for 30 years afterwards because of the stain on his record that he was dishonorably discharged with disgrace and could provide no references of a positive, supportive nature. He couldn't get a decent job. His entire life was ruined as a result of a military prosecution in the 1980s. Legislation authorising the sacking of seafarers for homosexual acts on UK merchant ships was not repealed until April 2017. April 2017. The centuries-old anti-gay laws were not abolished in 1967. They remained on the statute book under the heading, and I quote, unnatural offences. The very language of the law itself was bigoted and homophobic. The 2 main crimes affecting gay and bisexual men continued to be the law against anal sex, known in legal statute as, quote, buggery, and, quote, gross indecency, which sounds dreadful, but in fact was just any sexual contact between men other than anal sex, including mere touching and kissing. Under that law, you could be prosecuted and jailed for merely touching or kissing another man. There was also the offence of procuring, which simply means inviting, facilitating, or aiding and abetting gay sex. Now, bizarrely, the 1967 reform decriminalised anal sex in certain circumstances, but it banned men from procuring lawful anal sex for other males. So in other words, there was this partial decriminalisation, but actually helping to make it happen remained a crime. So if you were a man and you arranged a gay sex date for a friend with another friend of yours, that was procuring, and that was still deemed, after 1967, to be a serious sexual crime. Also, the law against soliciting and importuning remained in force, and it was interpreted to designate homosexuality as, quote, an immoral purpose. What was this terrible crime? It criminalised men chatting up men or loitering in public places with homosexual intent, even if no sexual act took place. So think about it. Boy meets girl in the street, they have a chat, they like each other, they exchange names and phone numbers, they agree to meet. It's perfectly natural, perfectly normal. It happens all over the country every day of the year. But even after 1967, if two men did exactly the same thing, they were committing a serious sex crime punishable with a maximum sentence of 2 years jail. Astonishingly, some men were convicted under this law, both before and after 1967, for merely smiling and winking at other men in the street. Unbelievable. Smiling or winking more than once constituted soliciting or importuning. There are also other arrests under ancient legislation against indecency, such as the indecency clauses of the Town Police Clauses Act of 1847 and the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860. The Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act was supposedly about regulations and protections for the church. But there was a clause in there about indecency, which actually was intended to refer to, interrupting ministers of religion in their services. But the term indecency was interpreted by some police forces around the country to mean literally sexual indecency, and men were arrested in church courtyards, church cemeteries, and so on under that law for cruising or sexual acts, including in the middle of the night when no one else is around apart from police spies. In addition, gay and bisexual men and some lesbians continued to be prosecuted right up to the 1990s under public order and breach of the peace laws for public displays of affection, such as kissing and cuddling. The 1986 Public Order Act was passed ostensibly to crack down on football hooliganism and street rioting. It had a clause in it which prohibited behaviour likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress. Within a couple of years of that legislation being passed, in the mid-1980s, the police interpreted that to cover same-sex affection in public places, that it was likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress to members of the public, and same-sex couples were arrested, convicted, and usually fined under that legislation. The 1967 decriminalisation simply meant that the long-standing homophobic laws were not enforced in some circumstances. But many aspects of gay male life remained criminal. In fact, the repression got much worse after 1967. There were police stakeouts in parks and toilets, sometimes using pretty police as bait to lure gay men to commit sex offences so they could then be arrested. So what many police forces would do would be choose a young, attractive officer, dress him up in tight white jeans, boots and a leather jacket, and send him into a public toilet or a park. He'd play or gesticulate with his willy, and any man who responded would get arrested. So this was actually agents provocateurs who were inciting the commission of sexual acts. And this was official police policy all over the country, post-1967. Many of you will know that lots of gay saunas were also raided. Again, right up into the 1990s, even here in Manchester. There were raids on private gay saunas where men were arrested, sometimes forced out into the streets and paraded in their underwear in full public view to deliberately and maliciously humiliate them. The charge of keeping a disorderly house was pressed against gay pubs and clubs that allowed same-sex couples to dance cheek to cheek. No sex, just simply dancing cheek to cheek. The Father Red Cap pub in South London, near where I live, was raided in the 1970s precisely on this point. It was deemed that the owners and the organisers were keeping a disorderly house by allowing men to dance together with each other in close physical proximity. In 1966, the year before the partial decriminalisation of male homosexuality, 420 men were convicted of the offence of so-called gross indecency. 420. My research has found that the number of convictions soared by over 400% to 1,711 in 1974. So in the space of 7 years, the number of convictions rocketed by over 400%. Why was this? It seems that the authorities were determined to ensure that the limited liberalisation of 1967 did not give a green light to what they still regarded as a vice and perversion. Indeed, the law lords ruled in 1973 that gay Lonely Heart adverts in IT magazine were, quote, a conspiracy to corrupt public morals. In other words, gay men placing adverts to meet each other, no sex involved, just placing the advert, that was a conspiracy to corrupt public morals. So despite the law reform of 1967, homosexuality was declared by their lordships as being only partly legal, not moral, and contrary to the public good. That judgment has never been repealed. Never been repealed. Also in this era, homophobic discrimination in housing, employment, and the provision of goods and services remained lawful by default. LGBT people who suffered discrimination had no legal redress. There had been laws to protect black and ethnic minority people, women and others, but no laws to protect LGBT people. Not until 2003, in the case of employment protection, and 2007 in the case of protection against discrimination in the provision of goods and services. So in the absence of any legal protection, people were denied employment or sacked from their jobs because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Many of you may have heard of the case of Tony Whitehead, who was employed by British Home Stores, who was sacked by BHS because he was gay and because he had attended a gay rights protest. It had nothing to do with his job. It was in his own private time, not in work hours. He'd not done anything obscene, just simply the fact that he was gay and had attended a gay rights protest brought the company into disrepute in their view, and he was summarily sacked. All his appeals were rejected. About a decade later, Susan Shell, a social worker in Barking in East London, was sacked simply because she was a lesbian. She was a perfectly good employee, an exemplary record, but she was dismissed because Barking Council said, we cannot have lesbians in our employment. And there were many, many, many others. There were also instances when people were refused rented accommodation or evicted from it. Some LGBT people were turned away from pubs and restaurants. In 1971, in West London, the Chepstow pub in Bayswater and other pubs in the area refused to serve LGBT people, particularly those who were involved in the newly formed Gay Liberation Front. Pure and outright homophobia. We had to organise sit-ins in that pub, modelled on the Black Civil Rights Movement, to get that pub and the other pubs in the area to stop refusing to serve LGBT people. And many of us were arrested. And the arrests were not simple arrests. I can remember being taken out of the Chepstow pub by burly officers, lined up against a wall, made to strip to my underpants, and then a big burly sergeant came along, put his hand in my underpants, and squeezed my testicles until I screamed. That's what the police were like in those days. Think about that when you see the police marching in LGBT pride parades. How many police forces have apologized for that rampant homophobia? Same with Joe Lyons Cafe in Piccadilly Circus, also in 1971. Refused to serve trans people. And again, there had to be a sit-in and a protest there before the Joe Lyons Cafe eventually relented and stopped that discrimination. For gay fathers and lesbian mothers, there was no change after 1967. In divorce cases, they routinely lost their children, lost custody of their children. Judges gave custody to totally unsuitable fathers, in some cases with criminal convictions and histories of domestic violence. They gave custody to such fathers rather than let those kids be brought up in a loving lesbian household. Absolutely shameful. The damage and wreck to those women's lives and the children's lives is incalculable. But that was the norm in the way in which the law operated after 1967. In the 1980s, the Conservative government's family values and Victorian values campaigns whipped up hysterical levels of homophobia. It was aided, of course, by the moral panic over AIDS, which was dubbed the gay plague. I know personal friends of mine, gay men, who went to the local pub and were turned away. We don't serve AIDS carriers, the publican said. Some were made to bring their own glasses. I know people who went to restaurants where somehow it was discovered or assumed they were gay, and they were told that to go home and bring their own cutlery. I know of instances where gay men were taken to court and forced to wear full body suits with masks, and the judge ordered, after the sentence had been passed, that the bodysuits and masks should be incinerated, quote, at the highest temperatures possible. The assumption was every gay and bisexual man had HIV, that every gay and bisexual man was a threat to the public health of the nation. Here in Manchester, the Chief Constable, James Anderson, criticised the LGBT community in inflammatory language, accusing us of, quote, swirling around in a cesspit of our own making. And his officers launched raids against clubs and bars all over this city. A deliberate, targeted campaign to criminalise the maximum number of gay and bisexual men, to maximise the number of arrests. And he was defended by the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. She defended James Anderson. She vetoed him being sacked for what was clearly an act of, or series of acts, of overt discrimination, never mind the insulting, abusive language that he used. Indeed, at the 1987 Conservative Party conference, the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, used her keynote speech to attack the notion that people had a right to be gay. The implication was that we didn't have that right. And she attacked those local authorities who were doing positive things to support LGBT communities. Very soon afterwards, of course, Section 28 was progressed through Parliament, the first new anti-gay law in Britain for nearly a century. A law that didn't just affect gay and bisexual men, but also lesbian women and trans people as well. Coinciding with this intolerant anti-LGBT atmosphere in the late 1980s was a massive rise in the arrests of gay men for consenting victimless behaviour. I have tried for years to get the Home Office to divulge the full statistics. They won't. But I did manage, through a sympathetic member of the Home Office, to get into the archives, and I found that in 1989 there were 1,718 convictions and cautions for gross indecency in England and Wales. Never mind Scotland and Northern Ireland. 1,718 in 1989. Compare that to the past. If you look at the total of recorded offences of gross indecency in 1989, it was 2,022. So you can see that the conviction rate was very high. 2,022 recorded offences and 1,718 convictions or cautions. Compare that 2,022 recorded offences with 1954. Almost as many. In 1954, there were 2,034 recorded offences of gross indecency, only just above the 2,022 such offences recorded in 1989. Remember that in 1954, homosexuality was totally illegal, and Britain was gripped by a McCarthyite-style anti-gay witch hunt. Hysteria in the press, mass arrests, denunciations in Parliament, and yet 1989 was almost as bad in terms of recorded offences of gross indecency. There was also, in the late 1980s, a huge increase in anti-LGBT violence. Between 1986 and 1991, I identified at least 50 murders of men in circumstances that pointed to a homophobic motive. And those are only the cases that I managed to find, trawling through national and local newspapers or having these cases reported to me. I suspect the real figure was much, much higher. Police investigations to catch the killers were derisory. We were still seen by many law officers as less than deserving of the protection of the law. Full legal reform, did not happen in England and Wales until 36 years after 1967. The gross indecency law that had been used to convict the computer genius Alan Turing in 1952, and before him to jail the playwright Oscar Wilde in 1895, these laws were not repealed until the Sexual Offences Act of 2003. Likewise, the law against anal sex was not repealed until 2003. So it was not until that year that for the first time in 470 years, England and Wales had a criminal code that did not penalise gay sexuality. In Northern Ireland, the ban on anal sex was eventually repealed in 2008. Scotland's anti-gay laws were abolished in 2009, but in the case of anal sex, did not take effect until 2013. So gay sex only ceased to be a crime in the United Kingdom a mere 4 years ago. Unbelievable, incredible, but true. It shows that the battle that began in 1967 was just the beginning, and we had to fight 50 years, almost 50 years more, to win that battle in terms of legal law reform, let alone all the other issues that still affect our community. It is a huge tribute to LGBT people across Britain and our straight friends and allies that we have had the patience, determination, and resolve to keep up that fight until legal equality was won in the criminal law. We had an uphill struggle against an all-powerful state and public institutions that were ranged against us. But we did not give up that fight. We continued it, and we eventually won. So this year, when we mark the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, let's recognise the gain, the achievement that it represented. But let's also not forget there were many, many further battles required before we won equality under the criminal code. Thank you.